Imagine building a life for 19 years, waking up next to the same man, cooking in the same kitchen, paying into the same mortgage, watching your children grow up with his last name. Now imagine picking up the phone one afternoon and finding out that the man you built all of it with never existed. Not in the way you thought. Not even close. In the spring of 2026, a woman named Camille was standing in her kitchen in Stone Mountain, Georgia, going through paperwork. Her husband Marcus had passed away 3 weeks earlier. A sudden cardiac arrest at 52. No warning, no history of heart trouble, just there one day and gone the next. The documents on her table were routine estate papers. She had made herself a cup of coffee, sat down, and started working through them the same way she handled everything in her life, steadily, carefully, page by page. She was 52 pages in when the phone rang. It was her attorney, and the first thing he said was, "Miss Porter, I need you to sit down." The Social Security number tied to Marcus Jerome Whitfield did not belong to Marcus Jerome Whitfield. It belonged to a baby girl named Diane Renee Whitfield, born in Montgomery, Alabama on March 3, 1965, and dead 21 days later. Diane never went to school, never held a job, never signed her name to a single document. She lived just long enough for her parents to bury her and file 2 pieces of paper with the county, a birth certificate and a death certificate, 3 weeks apart. And 61 years after that little girl was laid to rest, a man in Atlanta, Georgia was using her name to co-sign a mortgage, file joint tax returns, and sleep beside a woman who believed she knew everything about him. Camille had spent 19 years building what she believed was a real life, a real marriage, a real home. And in the space of one phone call, she learned that every piece of it, the wedding license, the deed to the house, the name she had taken as her own, had been constructed on the identity of a child who never got the chance to live. The question that broke her was not what the documents said. It was what they meant. Because if Marcus Whitfield was not real, then who had she been sleeping beside for 19 years? And what was he hiding that was heavy enough to make a man erase himself completely and become someone who had never even existed? Before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if this story already has your attention, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what we are about to walk through is not a short story. It goes deep, and every layer we pull back is darker than the one before it. Tonight we are going to follow Camille through every year of those 19, and by the end, you are going to ask yourself the same question she is still asking. Was there anything she missed? And if there was, could she have seen it in time? But here is what nobody in that attorney's office knew yet, and what nobody had told Camille in 19 years of marriage. She was not the first, and the woman who could have warned her had already tried. Now before we get into everything that happened, and there is a lot that happened, you need to understand something about Marcus Whitfield. This was not a careless man. This was not someone who threw a fake name together on a whim and hoped nobody noticed. What federal investigators would eventually uncover was a deception so carefully constructed, so thoroughly maintained across nearly 2 decades, that it had fooled a mortgage lender, a church congregation, 2 children, a probate court, and the United States federal government all at the same time. This was not a gap in the system. This was a man who had studied the system, found every opening it had, and walked through each one without leaving a single fingerprint behind. And the thing about that, the thing that makes this story so hard to sit with, is that Camille was not a woman who missed things. She was a marketing director. She managed budgets and teams and deadlines. She was the person her friends called when they needed someone to think clearly under pressure. She was not naive. She was not careless. She was a woman who had given her trust to one specific person completely and over a long period of time, and that person had spent every single day of those 19 years making sure that trust was never tested. Because the moment it was tested, everything would fall. So tonight, there are 3 questions that are going to drive everything you are about to hear. The first is the one Camille could not stop asking herself in that attorney's office. Who was Marcus Whitfield, really, before he became the man she married? The second is the question that investigators spent months trying to answer. What was he running from that was serious enough to make him steal the identity of a dead infant and build an entire life on top of it? And the third question is the one that is going to stay with you long after this video ends. How did a woman named Keisha, living 20 minutes away from Camille in Decatur, Georgia, Know the truth about Marcus 9 years before anyone else did? And why did nobody listen to her? Those 3 questions are the spine of this entire story, and we are going to answer all of them. But to understand the answers, you first have to understand who Camille was before Marcus came into her life. Because the way this man found her, chose her, and built his world around her, that was not an accident. That was a decision. And like everything else Marcus did, it was made with a precision that, looking back, is almost impossible to believe. Camille Porter grew up in Vine City, Atlanta, one of those neighborhoods that shaped you whether you asked it to or not. Her father Robert worked 30 years for the city. Her mother Dolores taught second grade 4 blocks from their front door. They were not wealthy people, but they were consistent people. And consistency, in the Porter household, was treated like a form of love. You showed up. You did the work. You built something real and you protected it. That was the standard Camille grew up inside, and it became the standard she carried into every room she walked into for the rest of her life. By 2007, she was 29 years old, working in marketing at a healthcare firm in Midtown Atlanta, attending church faithfully, and living a life that was small in the best possible way, intentional, grounded, and entirely her own. She had been seeing someone that year. Nothing serious. The kind of relationship that both people know, without saying it, has already run its course. She was in the process of ending it quietly when her pastor announced a fellowship dinner at the church. She almost didn't go. She was tired that week. She had a project due. She told her sister Yvonne she would skip it, and Yvonne, who had never once in her life accepted that answer, told her to put her shoes on. So she went. And that was the night she met Marcus. He was standing near the back of the room, holding a paper plate, listening more than he was talking. And something about that, the stillness of him, the way he seemed to be genuinely present in a room full of people performing their sociability, caught her attention before he ever said a word to her. He introduced himself as Marcus Whitfield. He said he had recently relocated from Birmingham. He was a logistics consultant, the kind of work that meant something different every time someone asked about it, which Camille would only reflect on much later. He was soft-spoken and direct in equal measure. He asked about her work and actually listened to the answer. He remembered details from one conversation and brought them back in the next. He did not rush anything. He was patient in the specific way that, when you are a woman who has spent time around impatient men, reads as maturity. Within 6 months they were serious. Within 18 months they were engaged. And in October 2008, in front of 200 people at New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, Camille Porter became Camille Whitfield. She thought it was the beginning of everything she had worked toward. In one sense, she was right. In every sense that mattered, she could not have been more wrong. Now here is where the story asks you to do something uncomfortable. It asks you to look at the red flags, because there were red flags, and to resist the urge to judge a woman for not seeing them as flags at the time. Because not one of these things, standing alone, would have alarmed you either. Marcus had no living family. His parents were gone, no siblings, no cousins, no one. He explained it simply. Loss, estrangement, a hard childhood he preferred not to revisit. He never wanted to go back to Birmingham. He handled all the household finances because, he said, Camille had enough on her plate, and he wanted to carry that weight. He had one phone he kept separate, a work phone, he said, for confidential clients. He paid for their honeymoon entirely in cash. He declined a DNA ancestry kit Camille gave him as a gift 2 Christmases into the marriage, setting it aside with a quiet smile and the words, "I'm just not interested in that stuff, baby." Every single one of those moments had an explanation. And every single one of those explanations was enough, until it wasn't. Because here is what 19 years of a life actually looks like from the inside. It looks like Tuesday. It looks like picking up Jordan from basketball practice and stopping for gas on the way home. It looks like a disagreement about the thermostat and a good weekend in Savannah, and a hard season at work and a slow Saturday morning with coffee and the news. Marcus coached Jordan's travel basketball team for 3 straight years. He sat in the front row at Aaliyah's school plays. He helped Camille's mother move into a smaller apartment after her father passed, carrying boxes without being asked. He was not a ghost in the life they shared. He was present. He was warm. And that is the part of this story that makes it so much harder to carry, because the lie was not lived at a distance. It was lived right up close, every single day, in all the ordinary moments that make a marriage feel real. But in 2009, Just 1 year into that marriage, something happened that Camille has never fully stopped thinking about. Her phone rang on a Wednesday afternoon. She did not recognize the number. She answered it, and the woman on the other end said, "Miss Porter, I know you don't know me, but I need you to hear what I'm about to tell you about your husband." Camille listened for about 45 seconds. Then she hung up. She told herself the woman was a jealous ex. She told herself that Marcus had already warned her, gently, carefully, the way he did everything, that there was someone from his past who did not handle the end of their relationship well. It fit the story he had already given her. It confirmed what she thought she already knew. So she set the phone down, went back to what she was doing, and never called back. It would be 17 years before she understood exactly what that phone call was really about. And by then, the damage was already done. April 4th, 2026 started like most Saturdays in the Whitfield household. Marcus was in his home office by 8 in the morning, which was not unusual. He kept irregular hours when he was working through a project, and Camille had long since stopped questioning the rhythms of it. Jordan was still asleep. Aaliyah was in the living room with her phone. Camille was in the kitchen when she heard the sound. Not a crash, not a cry, just a single heavy thud from behind the office door, the kind of sound that your body understands before your mind has caught up with it. She was through that door in seconds. Marcus was on the floor beside his desk. By the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing left to do. Cardiac arrest. No prior diagnosis. No warning. 52 years old and gone before the ambulance had even cleared the neighborhood. The days that followed moved the way grief always moves, in a blur that somehow also feels unbearably slow. There were phone calls to make and people to notify and children to hold and a funeral to plan, and Camille moved through all of it the way she moved through every hard thing in her life, which was forward. The service was held 12 days later at New Birth. 200 people filled those pews, friends, neighbors, church members, parents from Jordan's basketball years, colleagues Camille had never met in person. The pastor called Marcus a man of quiet strength. People nodded. Camille sat in the front row in black and held her children's hands and cried the way you cry when you lose someone you genuinely loved. Because she did. Whatever else is true about this story, that part is not in question. It was 3 weeks after the funeral when Raymond Cross called. He was the estate attorney Camille's pastor had referred her to years earlier. A calm, careful man with a small firm off Peachtree Road who handled the kind of straightforward estate work that most families need and nobody wants to think about until they have no choice. He had been thorough and kind through the initial paperwork, and Camille had trusted him immediately. When his name came up on her phone that Tuesday afternoon, she assumed it was a routine update. She answered with her coat still on, keys in her hand, halfway out the door to pick up Aaliyah from school. She did not make it to the car. Raymond told her that the social security number on file for Marcus Jerome Whitfield had returned a federal flag. He told her she needed to come into the office. She asked him what kind of flag, and he said, "The kind I cannot explain to you over the phone." She sat across from Raymond Cross that afternoon and looked at what he had laid out on the desk between them. Her husband's social security card. His Alabama driver's license from 2001. A printed federal database result with a name highlighted in yellow, Diane Renee Whitfield. A birth certificate dated March 3, 1965. A death certificate dated March 24, 1965. And a county records request form, yellowed and slightly brittle, filed sometime in the late 1990s by a man requesting a certified copy of Diane Whitfield's birth certificate. The handwriting on that form was not handwriting Camille recognized, and the name signed at the bottom was not Marcus Whitfield. It was a name she had never seen before in her life. She stared at it for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at Raymond and asked him what it meant. And Raymond, who had spent 20 years delivering difficult news with professional composure, looked back at her and said, "It means your husband may not have been who he said he was." What followed that sentence was 45 minutes of silence that Camille has described, in the months since, as the loudest silence of her life. Raymond walked her through it methodically. A ghost identity, the term investigators use when a living person assumes the records of a deceased infant, is not a new crime. It requires very little in the right era. A county clerk's office, a certified birth certificate, a social security application, a driver's license. Each document unlocks the next, and once the chain is built, it holds. The man who had built this particular chain had done it cleanly. There were no loose threads in the paperwork trail, no sloppy inconsistencies that should have raised a flag years earlier. Marcus Whitfield, on paper, was airtight, which meant that everything attached to that name, the mortgage, the marriage license, the joint accounts, the tax returns going back 19 years, was now legally uncertain in ways that Camille did not yet have the capacity to fully process. By the time she left Raymond's office that evening, 3 things had already been set in motion. The mortgage company had been notified of a potential title irregularity. The joint bank accounts had been flagged pending a fraud review, and a referral had been placed to the Atlanta Police Department's Identity Fraud Unit. Camille drove home in the dark and sat in her driveway for 20 minutes before she went inside. Jordan and Aaliyah were in the kitchen. They had made dinner. Pasta, the only thing Jordan reliably knew how to cook, and they had left a plate warm for her on the stove. She walked in, looked at her children, and decided in that moment that she was going to protect them from what she now knew for as long as she possibly could. She ate the pasta. She asked about their day. She held it together all the way until they went to bed. And then she called her sister Yvonne. And for the first time since Marcus died, she fell apart completely. But here is what nobody had told Camille yet, and what the fraud unit was about to discover within the first 48 hours of opening the case. The name on that county records request form, the one she didn't recognize, the one signed at the bottom in handwriting that wasn't her husband's, that name had a history. And that history had a woman attached to it. A woman who had been trying to tell someone, anyone, the truth about the man she knew as Marcus Whitfield for a very long time. Detective Renata Simmons had worked identity fraud for the Atlanta Police Department for 15 years. She had seen credit card theft and manufactured employment histories and forged degrees and benefit fraud and every variation in between. But ghost identities, the specific, deliberate kind where someone locates a deceased infant in a county death registry, pulls their birth certificate, and builds an entirely new human being from that single document forward. Those were different. They were rarer. And in Renata Simmons' experience, they almost always meant the same thing. The person who went to that kind of trouble was not running from a debt. They were not hiding from a bad credit score or an embarrassing past. People who erased themselves that completely, that carefully, were running from something that would follow them into a courtroom if they ever got caught. She opened the Whitfield file on a Thursday morning, and she did not go home that evening until she had read every page of it twice. The paper trail she began pulling on moved backward through time the way these cases always do, from the present, where the fraud had been living comfortably for years, into the past, where the seams began to show. The Marcus Whitfield identity surfaced cleanly in Atlanta in 2007, tied to a Georgia driver's license and a church membership, and eventually a mortgage. Before Atlanta, the same social security number appeared on a Birmingham, Alabama lease agreement from 2003. Before Birmingham, a Tuscaloosa, Alabama driver's license from 2001, the earliest document in the chain, the foundation stone of everything that came after it. And before Tuscaloosa, before 2001, before that driver's license was ever issued, there was nothing. No school enrollment, no employment record, no medical history, no trace of a living human being attached to that name anywhere in any database that Detective Simmons could access. Marcus Whitfield, prior to 2001, did not exist. Because prior to 2001, he had been someone else entirely. The name on the county records request form, the one Camille had stared at across Raymond Cross's desk without recognizing, came back in the system within 48 hours. It connected to an address in Tuscaloosa, and that address connected to a second name, a woman's name. Detective Simmons ran it, found a current address in Decatur, Georgia, and drove there on a Friday morning without calling ahead. She knocked on the door at 9:45. The woman who answered was 38 years old, and when she saw the badge, she did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a knock on a door for a very long time, and had quietly given up believing it would ever come. Her name was Keisha, and the first thing she said to Detective Simmons, standing in her doorway on that Friday morning, was, "I already know why you're here. I just didn't think it would take this long." Keisha had met the man she knew as Darnell in Birmingham in 2003. He was using a different name with her, not Marcus, not the name on the county form, but a third name entirely, which told investigators something important about the layers this man had been operating across simultaneously. The relationship had started the way these relationships often start, attentive, consistent, the feeling of being genuinely chosen by someone who seemed to see you clearly. But within a year the shape of it began to change. Not all at once. That is never how it happens. It changed the way water changes the surface of stone, slowly, quietly, in ways you only recognize when you step back far enough to see the damage. He began managing her finances. He discouraged friendships he deemed a distraction. He monitored her movements with questions that sounded like concern until they didn't anymore. And in the spring of 2005, after an argument that had been escalating for weeks, he put his hands on her. Keisha filed a police report the following day. A restraining order was issued by the court within the week. And within 30 days of that order being filed, the man she knew as Darnell was gone. No forwarding address. No final conversation. No trace. He had simply closed every door behind him and vanished. And within months, Detective Simmons would confirm, he had surfaced in Tuscaloosa under a new name, begun building the Marcus Whitfield identity in earnest, and by 2007 was sitting in a church fellowship hall in Atlanta presenting himself as a quiet, grief-softened man from Birmingham who just wanted to build something real. Keisha had found Camille on Facebook in 2009. She had spent 3 days composing what she wanted to say before she finally picked up the phone and called. Camille had hung up in under a minute. And Keisha, who understood better than most people what it felt like to not be believed, had eventually stopped trying. What she told Detective Simmons that Friday morning indicator filled in the last gap in the timeline that the paper trail alone could not close. Because Keisha remembered his real name. Not the name he had given her, and not the name on the county form, but the name she had heard him use once in a phone call he did not know she had overheard. A name he used with someone from his life before Birmingham, spoken in a tone she had never heard from him before. Flat. Careful. Like a man reminding himself of something he was trying to forget. She had written it down that same night, and kept it for 17 years in the back of a notebook she never threw away, because somewhere in her she had always believed that one day someone was going to need it. She went to the kitchen, came back with the notebook, and handed it to Detective Simmons without a word. The detective looked at the name. Then she looked at Keisha. And then she picked up her phone and started making calls. His real name was Derek Lamont Gaines. Born in Macon, Georgia, in 1973. And what the Bibb County court system returned when Detective Simmons ran, that name was exactly what she had suspected from the first morning she opened this file. A domestic violence conviction from the year 2000. A 5-year probation term. A mandatory registration requirement that Derek Gaines had simply chosen not to comply with. Instead, within months of that conviction, he had traveled to Montgomery, Alabama, located Diane Renee Whitfield's birth certificate in the county records office, and begun the quiet, methodical process of becoming someone the law could never find. By 2001 he had a driver's license. By 2003 he had a lease. By 2007 he had a church family, a woman who loved him, and a life so thoroughly constructed that not one person in his orbit had any reason to pull at the thread. Derek Lamont Gaines had been legally dead for 7 years before he ever walked into Camille's life. And Marcus Whitfield, the man she married, the man she buried, the man whose name her children still carried, had never existed at all. But there was still one question that none of this answered. The one that was keeping Camille Porter awake at 3 in the morning in a house she was no longer sure she legally owned. Not who he was, not what he had done before, but something quieter and harder and more personal than either of those things. She needed to know, in 19 years of a life built on a lie, whether any part of what he had given her was real. And what investigators found when they looked closely at Marcus Whitfield's finances was the last thing anyone in that case expected to find. The forensic accountant Raymond Cross brought and spent 11 days going through every financial record tied to the Marcus Whitfield identity. Every account, every transaction, every wire transfer, investment filing, and tax return going back to the earliest year on record. She was looking, as these reviews always look, for the signature of a man who had been stealing from his own family, hidden accounts, offshore movements, a second life somewhere being quietly funded while Camille paid the mortgage and raised the children and believed she was building something together. That is the story most people expected. That is the story that would have made a certain kind of sense given everything else they now knew about this man. It was not the story the forensic accountant found. What she found instead stopped everyone in that case cold, including Detective Simmons, who had spent 15 years believing she had seen every variation this kind of fraud could produce. Marcus had not been draining their accounts. He had not been maintaining a second family. He had not been moving money out of their shared life and into a hidden one. In fact, over the previous 9 years, quietly, without Camille's knowledge, without her name ever being mentioned to a broker or a financial institution in connection with the account, he had been routing money into a separate investment portfolio. The account was not joint. It carried no connection to the Marcus Whitfield identity whatsoever. It was titled solely and completely in the name Camille Renee Porter. Her maiden name, the name she had been born with. $214,000, accumulated over 9 years, in an account that the fraud investigation could not touch because it had never belonged to Marcus Whitfield at all. It had always belonged entirely to her. Investigators spent several days trying to determine the intent behind it. The most straightforward explanation, and the one that the evidence most consistently supported, was also the hardest one to sit with. At some point in the years after their marriage, Marcus had understood, at whatever level such a man is capable of understanding, that the life he had built was always going to collapse. The documents were too old. The chain was too long. The longer a ghost identity holds, the more exposure it accumulates, and there is a point in every case like this where the architecture of the lie becomes too heavy for any single man to keep standing indefinitely. Whether Marcus knew it consciously or simply felt it the way you feel a storm before it arrives, nobody could say with certainty. But the account said something. 9 years of consistent, deliberate deposits into a fund that only Camille could access said something that no investigator's report and no court filing was ever going to be able to fully translate into language. Camille sat with that information for 4 days before she could talk about it. She sat with it the way you sit with something that refuses to resolve into a single feeling, because it was not absolution, and it was not proof of love, and it was not an apology, and it did not give her back 1 hour of the 19 years she had spent beside a man whose real name she never knew. But it was real. And in a story where almost nothing turned out to be what it appeared, real was not nothing. Her sister Yvonne, who had driven over the night Camille finally told her about the account, sat across from her at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I don't know what to do with that either." And they both just sat there in the quiet of it, because some things do not have a clean response. Some things just have to be held. It was Yvonne who was with Camille the afternoon she decided to tell Jordan and Aaliyah the truth. Not all of it. Not the domestic violence conviction, not the prior victim, not the full forensic accounting of who their father had been before he became their father. But the essential thing. The thing they were going to find out regardless, because legal proceedings do not stay private and children are not as shielded from the world as their parents hope. Jordan was 16. He sat in the living room and listened without interrupting, which was something he had always done, a stillness he had inherited from a man whose real name he was only now learning was not the name he had grown up carrying. When Camille finished, Jordan was quiet for a moment. Then he asked one question. He did not ask what his father's real name was. He did not ask about the fraud or the identity or the legal implications for their last name. He asked, was he good to us? And Camille, who had every reason in the world to answer that question with anger, sat with it for a long time before she spoke. Then she said, "He was good to you. He was good to both of you. And I don't know what to do with that yet. But it's true." Aaliyah, who was 13 and had always been the more openly emotional of the two, cried for a long time that evening. Jordan held it together until he thought no one was watching, and then cried in the hallway outside his room, where he believed the door had fully closed but hadn't. Camille heard him and did not go in. She understood, in the particular way that mothers understand these things, that some grief needs a closed door and a little darkness to move through properly. She leaned against the wall in the hallway and listened to her son process the loss of a father he had already lost once, and she let herself feel the full weight of what this man had done, not just to her, but to 2 children who had loved him without reservation and now had to figure out what to do with that love when the person it belonged to had never fully existed. Meanwhile, in Decatur, Georgia, a woman named Keisha received a letter from the Atlanta District Attorney's Office on a Tuesday morning in June. The letter informed her that the individual identified in court records as Derek Lamont Gaines had been formally connected to the Marcus Whitfield identity. that his 2000 domestic violence conviction had been updated in the state system to reflect his assumed name and all associated records, that her 2005 police report and the restraining order that followed it had been officially entered into the permanent case file, acknowledged by the court, and preserved. Derek Gaines was dead and could not be prosecuted. The letter was careful to say that clearly. But Keisha's account of what had happened to her was now part of the official record of who this man had been. She sat in her car in her driveway for a long time after she read it. She had not wanted a conviction. She had not wanted revenge in any form she could have named. What she had wanted, for 17 years, in every room she had carried this story into alone, was to be believed. And on a Tuesday morning in June 2026, in a letter from a district attorney's office in Atlanta, she finally was. Under Georgia property law, a title held in a fraudulent identity is not simply a paperwork problem. It is a legal crisis. And the specific nature of the crisis Camille now faced was this. The deed to the house in Stone Mountain had been filed in the name Marcus Jerome Whitfield. Not Camille. Not both of them jointly. Marcus alone. Camille's name was on the mortgage, which meant she had been making the payments, which meant she had the financial record of ownership without the legal document to match it. Her attorney explained it to her plainly in their first meeting. The mortgage proved she had been paying for the house. The deed proved that the person who had legally owned it never existed. And in the space between those two facts lived a dispute that a Fulton County court was now going to have to resolve. A lien was placed on the property within weeks of the fraud investigation going formal. Camille could not sell the house, could not refinance it, could not use it as any form of collateral while the dispute was active. She was living inside a home she had paid into for 12 years that the legal system was now treating as an open question. And the cruelty of it, the specific, exhausting cruelty of it, was that she had to keep living there through all of it. She had to make her children breakfast in that kitchen every morning and drive them to school, and come home every evening to a house whose ownership was being argued over in a courthouse 20 minutes away, by people who had never planted a single hydrangea in that backyard or watched a single birthday pass inside those walls. She took $40,000 from the account Marcus had set aside in her name, and she hired the best property attorney she could find. Her name was Diane, a quiet, precise woman who had spent 18 years untangling exactly this kind of legal wreckage, and who told Camille in their first meeting, without softening it, that this was going to be a long fight. Camille told her she understood. Diane looked at her across the desk the way people look at you when they are deciding how much resolve you actually have, and then she opened her notepad and said, "Then let's get started." What followed was 8 months of filings and hearings and depositions and counterfilings. 8 months of Camille sitting in courtrooms and conference rooms in her own kitchen at midnight reading documents she had never expected to need to understand, fighting for something that had always been hers in every way that mattered and was only in dispute because of a lie she had never told. In December of 2026, a Fulton County judge issued his ruling. He found that Camille Renee Porter had made continuous and documented mortgage payments on the property for 12 consecutive years, that she had maintained the home as her primary residence throughout that period, that she was the mother of 2 minor children who had lived in that home for the entirety of their lives, and that the fraudulent nature of the deed, while serious and legally significant, did not override the documented reality of her occupancy and financial investment in the property. The fraudulent title was vacated. A new deed was drawn up and filed with the county. And for the first time in the entire history of that house in Stone Mountain, the name on the deed was the name of someone who had actually lived there. Camille Renee Porter. Her name. The one she had been born with. The one that had always been real. She stood in Raymond Cross's office the afternoon the paperwork was finalized, and she held that deed in both hands, and she did not cry. She had expected to cry. She had imagined this moment during some of the hardest nights of the past 8 months, and in those imaginings she had always been crying. But standing there with the document in her hands, what she felt was not relief exactly, and not joy, and not the clean resolution that the end of a long fight is supposed to deliver. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated than any of those things. She felt the particular weight of a woman who has had to prove, in a court of law, that the life she lived was real, that the payments she made were real, that the children she raised were real, that she was real. She stood there holding that deed, and she said to Raymond Cross, This is the first thing in this entire story that is actually mine. And Raymond Cross, who had spent 20 years keeping professional distance from his client's grief, did not say anything back. He just nodded. Because there was nothing to say to that. It was simply true. On the 12th of December, 2026, 8 months after she had first sat in Raymond's office and looked at documents she could not argue with, Camille Porter drove to Montgomery, Alabama. She had done the research herself, on a quiet Sunday afternoon while the children were out, tracing the Whitfield family records through county archives until she found what she was looking for. Emmett and Ruth Whitfield, Diane's parents, were buried in a small cemetery on the eastern edge of the city. And in the far corner of that cemetery, beneath an oak tree that had grown wide and unhurried over 60 years, there was a small stone marker that most visitors walked past without slowing down. It was no bigger than a shoebox standing on its end. It said simply, Diane Renee Whitfield. March 3rd, 1965. March 24th, 1965. Nothing else. No verse. No endearment. Just a name and 2 dates 21 days apart, which was the entire length of a life that someone had decided, decades later, was useful enough to steal. Camille had thought about what she wanted to say on that drive down. She had composed something in her head somewhere around the Georgia-Alabama state line. A few sentences that felt right in the silence of the car, but seemed smaller when she tried to hold them against the reality of that stone. She stood there for a long time in the December cold with the flowers she had brought, and she looked at Diane's name, and she let go of whatever she had planned to say. Then she said the only thing that felt true. She said, I'm sorry your name was used this way. You deserved better than that. And so did I. Then she set the flowers down, stood there a little longer, and drove back to Atlanta. Back to her children. Back to the house, whose deed now carried her name. Back to the work of figuring out what it means to rebuild a life, when the foundation you thought you were standing on was never there to begin with. What Camille's case brought into public focus was something that federal investigators had been tracking quietly for years. The practice of assuming a deceased infant's identity to construct a new life is not a relic of a less connected era. It is an ongoing and documented form of fraud that continues to move through American institutions in ways that routine verification processes are only beginning to catch up with. The Social Security Administration's own auditors have confirmed that the Social Security numbers of deceased individuals have been used to generate millions of dollars in fraudulent wages and benefits across multiple investigation periods. Real cases have been prosecuted across the country, in Boston, in Ohio, in North Carolina, involving individuals who assumed infant identities and used them to obtain passports, employment, university admissions, and in at least one documented case, pandemic relief loans. The infrastructure for this kind of fraud was easier to exploit in earlier decades, but it has never fully closed. And the people who fall into the wreckage of it are almost never the ones who built the lie. They are the ones who simply loved someone they believed was real. Camille went back to work in September of 2026, while the legal fight for the house was still ongoing. Same job, same office, same drive down I-20 in the Atlanta morning. She changed her name back to Porter in July, quietly and without announcement, the way she did most things that mattered to her. She told her children they could choose what they wanted to carry. Jordan kept Whitfield. He sat with it for 2 weeks, and then told his mother that the name had been his whole life, and whatever it was built on, it was still the name he had grown up inside, and he was not ready to let it go. Aaliyah took Porter. She said she wanted to start fresh. Camille told them both that she understood, because she did. There is no right answer to the question of what you do with a name that turns out to belong to a ghost. There is only the answer that you can live with. And in the Porter household, in the house in Stone Mountain with the wraparound porch and the deed that finally said the right name, 2 children gave 2 different answers. And both of them were right. There is a question that sits underneath everything you have just heard. Not the legal question, not the investigative question, not even the question of who Marcus really was before he became the man Camille married. Those questions have answers now, or close enough to answers that the people involved can live with them. The question that does not have an answer, the one that Camille herself has said she is still working through in the quiet of ordinary evenings when the children are in their rooms and the house is still, is this. What do you do with love that was real on your side, when you discover it was built on something that was never real on his? What do you do with 19 years of genuine feeling when the person those feelings were directed toward was, in the most literal sense, a fiction? That is not a legal question. No court ruling resolves it. No deed filed in your name closes it. It is simply something a woman carries, and figures out how to carry, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. What this story asks of the people who hear it is not sympathy, though sympathy is a natural response. What it really asks is something harder. It asks you to sit with the fact that Camille Porter was not a woman who missed the obvious. She was sharp and grounded and faithful and present. She was, by every reasonable measure, paying attention. And it still happened to her. Which means the lesson here is not about what she should have done differently. The lesson is about what this kind of deception actually looks like from the inside, which is nothing like what we are taught to watch for. It does not announce itself. It does not come with visible cracks or obvious inconsistencies or the dramatic warning signs that make for clean television. It comes wrapped in consistency and patience and the particular warmth of a person who has studied, carefully, exactly what you need to feel safe. And by the time the warmth starts to feel like something else, you have already built your whole life inside of it. Keisha Bryant, as of the recording of this documentary, is still living in Decatur, Georgia. She has not spoken publicly about the case beyond her cooperation with investigators. The people close to her say she is doing well. That is the entirety of what she has chosen to share with the world, and it deserves to be treated as enough. She waited 17 years to be believed. What she does with that belief now belongs entirely to her. Jordan Whitfield is 17 years old and still plays basketball. Aaliyah Porter is 14 and has, according to her mother, recently decided she wants to be an attorney. Camille finds that both funny and entirely fitting. Raymond Cross added identity verification to every standard estate consultation his firm handles, effective June 2026. He has said in interviews that the Whitfield case changed the way he thinks about routine paperwork, that there is no such thing as a routine document, that every piece of paper tells a story, and sometimes the story it tells is not the one anyone expected. And Diane Renee Whitfield, the baby girl born in Montgomery, Alabama in the early days of March 1965, who lived for 21 days and was buried before the spring had fully arrived, rests in that cemetery on the eastern edge of the city with fresh flowers on her grave that were not there before December of last year. Someone put them there. And whoever tends that cemetery has noticed that the flowers keep being replaced. Quietly. Without announcement. The way Camille Porter does most things that matter to her. Now we want to hear from you. Because this community is one of the most thoughtful we have ever built. And the conversations in the comments section of this channel consistently go deeper than anything we could have scripted. So tell us, at what point in this story would you have started asking questions? Is there a moment, looking back at everything Camille shared, where you believe the truth was close enough to the surface that something different might have changed the outcome? And what do you think about the account Marcus left behind in her name? Does that change anything for you? Or does it change nothing at all? There is no right answer. There is only the honest one. And we genuinely want to know what yours is. Before we go, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We love knowing where this community reaches, and we read far more of your messages than you probably realize. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you pick up your phone and want to send it to someone you love, please do that. Share it with her. Because the woman who needs to hear this story is not always the woman who thinks she does. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already, because what is coming to this channel in the weeks ahead is some of the most powerful storytelling we have ever put together, and you do not want to be the person who finds out about it late. We will see you in the next one. And until then, stay close, stay grounded, and never stop asking the questions that matter.